You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
3CR is about community, and we welcome your participation at the station.
3CR is open to a wide diversity of volunteers and is a great way to connect with Melbourne's activist community.
Have you ever thought about volunteering, doing a reception shift, getting a program on air?
Training in radio skills or contributing to one of the station's committees.
There are many ways to be involved at 3CR.
To find out more, go to 3cr.org.au and get in touch.
That plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction, in the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. My name is Joseph Toscano. I'm hosting today's program. And if you're wondering what's going to happen over the festive season, yes, we will be broadcasting on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. So hopefully you'll be able to listen in on your local community radio station. Look, I know it's Christmas Day, I know it's New Year's Day, and you'll be doing things, but relax. The program is podcast. You can access it any time by going to 3cr.org.au. And if you think the definition of anarchy has changed because of the state of the world, no. Anarchos means without rulers. The anarchist struggle is the struggle to create a society without rulers, not without rules. A society based on, believe it or not, access to wealth, access to power. Not through hierarchical means, but through representative, not even representative systems, but through direct democratic organisations and organs, and access to the Commonwealth for everybody. Simple concept. And why those concepts? Because it's inequalities in power and wealth which give rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people, as we experience and see every day on the planet since time immemorial. So the anarchist struggle, whether it succeeds or not, is that relevant. What is relevant is that struggle to create a society where power and wealth is shared by all. All right, let's move on. I love living in the land of milk and honey, Australia, if you're wondering where I'm talking about. Because it's wonderful how state governments, there are 6 state governments and 2 territory governments, and the federal government, actually the way they make legislation, I've been amazed. Well, I'm actually not amazed, it's simple. Parliamentary legislated by media. Okay? Not by pressure from party members or pressure from the community as a whole, but pressure by the corporate-owned media and to a much lesser extent the government-gelded ABC, but mainly the corporate-owned media. Parliamentary legislation by media. Give you an example, and it's always parliamentary legislation by media where people who are involved in activities which challenge the power of the corporate world and the state seem to be the typical targets, not those that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, they're hanger-oners. It's always those people involved in struggle to devolve power, share wealth. The classical example, which has gone to the High Court, is the dissolution of the Construction, Forestry, Mining, Maritime and Energy Union, CFMEU. All right? The destruction of the CFMEU through an Act of Parliament. And why did we see the destruction of the CFMEU through an Act of Parliament? Because allegations were raised in the corporate-owned media regarding certain activities carried out by officials in the CFMEU, right? Allegations. Now, we saw the allegations which were made into the financial sector, and we saw the creation of a Royal Commission to look at the allegations, and then we've seen that nobody, although the Royal Commission was scathing in its report on the activities of the major banks in this country and other financial institutions, nothing really happened. And it's business as usual. Go into any local financial institution and you'll realise it's business as usual, where they ask you for respect when they pay you, as the person who pays their wages, no respect. But that's a different story we'll talk about another day. So we've got allegations which appeared in the media, not allegations which were, investigated by relevant bodies and police at the state and federal level, and charges were then laid, and then the matter was heard in court, and the individuals involved would appear in court, and then possibly they may have been convicted and punished. No. What you do is when allegations are raised by the media, by the corporate-owned media, the federal government buckles at the knee. Now, I'm sure if Mr Dutton, the Bradbury of the Australia in 2024, had heard the same allegations, he would have gone exactly through the same procedures and even made it even more difficult for what was left of the CFMEU. So this is what I talk about, parliamentary legislation by media. So instead of facing the media and saying, look, these are serious allegations, there are mechanisms in place by which these allegations can be investigated. If there's enough evidence collected that people have to be, the charges are laid, well, that matter will be determined by a court. No. The media makes some allegations and, hey, presto, bingo, you've got it, Action, parliamentary legislation. We don't see the same urgency when we talk about the 1.5 million children in this country of 26 million people living in poverty. We don't see the same. These are not allegations. These are facts. We don't see this, the same effort by Parliament to actually deal with a much more virulent, ugly problem than anything ever done by the CFMEU. No, we put that on the back burner and give money to private charities, mainly religious run, to do the state's work for them. No. Let's look at another example at the state level, the Victorian government. Our friends in the Victorian government, the Jacinta Allan-led Labor Party, or Labor state government. Now, obviously, when you look at the opposition, God, I won't even talk about the opposition in Victoria, but I'm interested in the concept of parliamentary legislation by media, okay? A synagogue burns down in Ripponlea. Arson. Obviously, nobody's been charged for that at this particular point in time. The media goes ballistic across the country. Federal Parliament, passes legislation, gives money away left, right and centre to try to hose down the situation. The Victorian State Parliament goes one step further and is going to introduce a whole host of reforms. You like that? Reforms, in inverted commas, to make things better, to resolve the issue. Banning flags, stopping people protesting outside places of worships, banning masks, stopping people from carrying glue and ropes. Yep, you wouldn't want to be a window cleaner, would you? And everybody jumps up and down. Look, take a bow. Take a bow. Protest is effective. And that's why governments at the state and federal level, prodded by the corporate-owned media, are beginning to pass legislation to remove so-called rights that we as citizens and permanent residents have enjoyed since Federation. Okay? But there's only one problem. One major problem. Australia has the weakest constitutional and legal protections for basic human rights than any other Western parliamentary democracy, including Mother England. Can you imagine it? So you see, constitutions are put in place to protect people from the arbitrary exercise of state power, as well as obviously they're put in place to maintain the status quo. Let's not forget that. At least in the US Constitution, there are some protections of individual rights. See, the thing about federal parliament in this country and state governments, as we saw during COVID-19, they have unlimited legislative power. And it's worse in Queensland, where they only have one house of parliament, where there is no upper house to try to modify reforms or legislation which goes through parliament. Because there are very few, if any, constitutional protections in Australia regarding freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to basically cross state boundaries. And the list goes on and on. When you look at the Australian Constitution and you look for those so-called constitutional freedoms we have, which countless Australians have died for in foreign wars, we don't have freedom of speech, we don't have freedom of association, we don't have freedom of assembly. And that's why the Bjelke-Petersen government, almost 50 years ago, could pass legislation to restrict people from gathering in groups of greater than 3 and penalising them. And that's why the federal government can actually pass legislation to criminalise the CFMEU without going through the proper processes which are put in place to ensure that people have a chance of defending themselves. And that's why we see the Victorian government now pass this raft of legislation regarding protests. So every time protest activity becomes a little bit too hot to handle by the authorities, what we see is the corporate-owned media baying for blood. and our parliamentary representatives jumping up and down and, obeying their masters. Now, those of you who think the legacy media is irrelevant, think again. Most crap you see on social media, it's got some type of political, social or cultural bent, basically appears to a significant degree in the legacy media long before it's discussed, dissected, and regurgitated on social media. So getting back to this constitutional protection. See, the Australian Constitution is basically a document which protects the rights of the state, because the dilemma that Britain had in 1901 was the fact that there were 6 independent colonies on Mother Australia or Mother Earth. 6 independent colonies. And they, through a referendum, had to decide to unify. And although there was a 10-year process, a number of referendums, it was decided by our founding fathers that we didn't need or didn't want constitutional protections. Because this constitution is basically about regulating the relationship and determining which entity, whether it's the federal entity or the state entity, has power to deal with a specific situation. So every time protest activity gets a little bit too hot for the government to handle, they pass legislation to remove what we're told are our inalienable rights. We have no inalienable human rights in Australia, except for 4, and hopefully I can remember them because they're so... 1, there is a freedom to pursue your religious beliefs. All right? Tick. Hundreds of millions of people have died since time immemorial as one group has tried to impose their religious beliefs on another group because they are the only ones who worship the true gods. But that's another story which I'll look at the program I'll be doing on the 25th of December, Christmas Day. Then you've got the right to fair compensation if the federal government grabs your land. Okay? And I think, and I could be wrong here, that you have a right to trial by jury for a major crime, but I could be wrong there. But the one I love, the 4th one I love, is the fact that you cannot be discriminated against. You say, wow, that's great. Sorry, boys and girls. It's not about gender. It's not about sexual orientation. It's not about race. It's not about whether you're a First Nations person. No, you can do all that. We've seen it with the White Australia policy. The first piece of legislation that went through the federal parliament in 1901 with one dissenting voice. I've got to find out who that dissenting voice was. No, don't have to worry about that. You cannot be discriminated against in this country because of the state you reside in. Now, it may sound a bit funny in 2024, but in 1901 it was very important because we had the ridiculous situation where every state had its own navy and armed forces, and we had this ridiculous situations where people had to get off the train at the border, at the Victorian New South Wales border because the railway gauge was different. So to be discriminated against because you came from Queensland or New South Wales or Victoria was a real issue in 1901. So you've got that constitutional protection. So if somebody calls you a bloody Queenslander, you can always take them to the High Court, can't you, if you've got a few $1 million. And that's it. The High Court over 2 decades ago had to find there was an implied right to freedom of speech during an election campaign. not outside an election campaign, because you couldn't hold an election without freedom of speech. So this opens, and why is this so important? It's so important because it opens the gateway to state and federal governments to pass draconian legislation, because there is no protection for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. That's why, during the current investigation into the arson at the Ripponlea synagogue, if the authorities believe, and the key word is believe, not know, but believe, that you may have information, inadvertently have information that may assist them in their investigations. And this is why, once it was declared a terrorist act by the state government, everything changed. You can be whisked away from anybody you know. You can be held for 7 days. If you refuse to answer questions, you can be jailed for up to 5 years. And if at the end of 7 days, if they turf you out without charge, if you tell anybody that you've been spirited away by the authorities for questioning, you can be charged. I'm sure Assad would have loved to have that type of legislative power where you can bundle somebody into a black tinted car and take them away for 7 days and badger them, and then if they don't talk, you can jail them for 5 years. Now, I'm not talking about Putin's Russia or Assad's Syria, as it was a few weeks ago. I'm talking about dear old Australia, the land of opportunity, freedom. What a load of garbage. So every time they take something away, it's because you are a threat to that order. You are a threat to those institutions. So take a bow. Take a bow. That's all I can say. You listen to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. Now, the Syrian situation, I think people have now begun to realise, although a lot of us knew for a long time, the brutality of the Assad regime, as people are freed from hundreds of prison in the Syria that Assad was actually able to control. But what we must remember is the current people who have liberated Syria are basically being supported by the Turkish government, or the government of Turkey, as we're supposed to call it these days. And they are hell-bent on preventing the creation of an independent Kurdish state. Now, on top of that, in northeast Syria, which was the home of ISIS, we have an autonomous region which self-governs to a significant degree on principles we talk about on this program. And you may remember about 2 years ago we did a series of 10 programs with people from that region. Now, they've been under extreme pressure from the Turkish government all along, which continues to use drones to target people and infrastructure in this autonomous zone. There is a real risk that Turkish forces, or forces from Turkey, will invade this area in order to reintegrate this autonomous region back into the Syrian state. But they will have a fight, because people there have got used to the fact of having autonomy, of having self-management, of using direct democracy as a mechanism via which to regulate their affairs. So just keep your eyes and ears open about what's going to happen or what's going to happen in that region. Now, at the same time, don't forget the great phrase, war criminals prosper. Prosper. War criminals prosper. And there is no greater war criminals than the current Israeli government under the war criminal, Mr. Netanyahu, who has had an international warrant placed on his head for war crimes. You know, the United States ally, you know, and our friend in the Middle East. Now, while we are talking about the overthrow of the Assad regime, and as I said last week, the Assad regime was Israel's best friend because it ensured that the border between Israel and Syria was peaceful, because all Assad was interested in was maintaining his own authority in, you know, that part of Syria that he was able to control. With the fall of the Assad regime, the Israeli government, under the war criminal, Mr. Netanyahu, has gone all out bombing across Syria to such a degree that one bomb, which targeted a munitions dump, created a grade 3 earthquake on the Richter scale. Could you imagine that? So while the Syrian people are trying to get some type of regularity and introduce changes in that country, we see the Israeli forces bombing almost on a daily basis, hundreds of sorties over the last 2 weeks, in an effort to contain any resistance. What a policy. How to win friends and influence people. How to win friends and influence people. They think they can bomb their way to security. All they're doing, as I keep saying, is creating another generation of people thirsting for revenge. Because, see, while I talk, it's Christmas, isn't it? It's nice. Well, next week will be. And if you've got kids or grandkids, you know, whether you're religious or not, you kind of get caught up in the festive atmosphere. It's a time where people come together. Families come together. People come together to use the holidays they have to, you know, be human. And you exchange gifts. You may exchange gifts. You may put up a Christmas tree. You may say, you know, bollocks to the whole thing, but you go to the family Christmas function because, you know, it's the time once a year you get together, and it's a time of goodwill and peace, using the biblical analogy, among men and possibly women and children. All right? Goodwill and peace. Now, most people in Gaza are Muslims. Some are atheists, like you and me, or possibly some of you that are listening. Some are Christians. Some may have other different religious beliefs. And I understand Eid will be in March this year. And the way the brutality continues in Gaza, the carnage, it's not a war, it's carnage, you know. I mean, what we see in the Ukraine and Russia, that's a war. You got people that have got, you know, weapons on both sides. This is This is carnage. Kill one Hamas fighter, collaterally kill another 50 people, mainly women and children and old people. Doesn't matter. They're Palestinians. Doesn't matter. That's the philosophy. The hostages? What hostages? Israeli government is acting as if there are no hostages in Gaza. And they don't even bother now at talking about the hostages. So, war criminals prosper because of us. That's right. Because of us. Not because of you and me. Well, we do what we can. But war criminals prosper because our governments are not willing to stand up, like many governments around the world, and say, enough is enough. I'll give you an analogy, I'll give you an analogy. If somebody broke into, say, a complex I was living in, somebody broke into a complex or a house I was living in, right? And they had a knife, and I was foolish enough to resist. And in the ensuing struggle, the knife went through their heart and they died. All right? That's in Australia. Okay? There'd be a police investigation. I may or may not be charged with a crime. And that's the end of it. But let's look at the Gaza situation. The same person breaks into my house, right? Or the house I'm living in. I get involved in a struggle with them. This time the knife goes through my heart and I fall down dead. Now, obviously, the people in that house, my family and friends, want some type of accountability, okay? They want accountability. They want the perpetrators to be punished. And obviously, if the person who was involved in that altercation was arrested, it'd go through the courts, there'd be some determination, and that would be the end of that particular issue. Not for my family, because maybe they would have grieved, maybe not. But as far as the law is concerned, it didn't give my family the right to go out there and kill every person who was related to the person who killed me. And this is what we are seeing in Gaza. Although over 1,200 Israelis were killed by Hamas on the 7th of October, and over 200 were taken as hostages, the fact is, it's not every Palestinian who lived in Gaza who was responsible for that outrage. Even if you ignore the 70 years of brutality which Palestinians have suffered at the hands of the Israeli state, even if you ignore that, the fact is, what we are now seeing is the collective punishment of every person living in Gaza because of the actions and activities of the group which govern them at that particular point in time. And that's outrageous. Outrageous. I mean, one of the most haunting images I've seen, and I've been around a long time on the planet, I've been a doctor for 49 years, and you see a lot of horrible things in that time. One of the most haunting images was a woman cradling a child who'd been blown to bits, wrapped in a sheet, blood-soaked sheet, crying out, this is in Gaza, just a few months ago, we are not animals. I can assure you, if I started cutting the throats and indiscriminately killing animals in this state, I can assure you the uproar would be extraordinary. I'd be charged, I'd be public enemy number one, and I'd find myself rotting in jail. And if I was unlucky, I'd get bashed while I'm in jail because I'm an animal killer. So think about it. Analogies. We're all going to have a nice Christmas. But how about the people in Gaza? If they don't celebrate Christmas, are they going to have a nice Eid in March? I doubt it. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscano. Now, next week I'll be doing a program specifically on religion. That's for Christmas Day. And the week after I'll be doing a program on, I think I'm going to emulate King Charles. Yeah. If he can do a New Year's Dave's message to the nation, why can't I? I think I'll do that next week. I mean, the week after for New Year's Day. So if you're a regular listener to the Anarchist World This Week, I will still be you'll still be able to hear the Anarchist World This Week. And obviously, if you're a normal human being and you're celebrating with people and your friends on the day, well, don't despair. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au, and if you're an abnormal human being, well, you're entitled to listen to it if you want to. All right, let's move on. Everything is up for discussion, isn't it, in this country, except the elephant in the room. Now, if you're sitting in a little room somewhere, standard little unit somewhere you've paid $500,000, $1 million, or $1.5 million for, and you're paying body corporate fees of between $5,000 to $10,000 a year, and you're paying rates in electricity and water. No, I don't want to depress you. And you're sitting there, and there's an elephant, a large elephant in the room. And considering how small most rooms are these days, it's taking up about 80% of the space, and it's just looking at you and saying, "Oh, you going to say anything about me? You going to say anything? You going to say anything?" And you decide, that's a big elephant. I think I'll just ignore it and live in my 20% of the room. Well, that's what life is like in Australia in 2024, okay? So what's the elephant in the room? What is the elephant in the room which has a profound impact on over 80%, possibly even 90% of the Australian population? What's the elephant? Well, you see, I know this is a little bit repetitive, but, when you're trying to engineer political change, repetition does help because things don't really change, do they? Well, here you are, okay? You're in the room. What's the elephant? Well, it's simple. The elephant in the Australian room is the fact that 1% own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and they're doing exceptionally well on every available indicator, and that about 9% are hanging on their coattails and are making a little bit of money as investors, while the rest of the population, gets by day to day unless something catastrophic happens, and then they're in trouble. So the elephant in the room is that we live on a continent, and there's only 26 million people living on this continent. I know we keep saying it's the desert. But again, it's, we could have 100 million, 200, 300, and I think we could survive, maybe even prosper. But getting back, we've got 26 million people, and it's a resource-rich continent. We're resource-rich in terms of agricultural exports to the rest of the world, and we're resource-rich in terms of the minerals that come out of the earth in this country. Extraordinary amount of minerals. Now, the dilemma is very simple. It's very simple. How can we ignore the fact that First Nations people continue, in the majority of cases, to live lives that are far, far, far removed from the lives that the rest of the country can live. And how come 1/3 of the population live a hand-to-mouth existence because they're reliant on a social security system which barely covers the basic necessities? Although I understand the Moreton Bay Council in Queensland has resolved the problem of homelessness, they're going to ban it and take away the homeless people's pets. I like that. We need the vagrancy laws brought back across the country. That'll deal with the problem. And so how come the rest of the population, about 75, about the rest of the other 60%, spend most of their time trying to earn a buck in order to pay for expenses to maintain, a reasonable lifestyle. And if they lose their jobs, they're stuffed. Huh? It's a rich country. We should have a universal basic income where people have a choice of whether they want to work or not. Artificial intelligence is with us. It's around the corner. We don't need every human being to sacrifice their lives as a wage slave. We have enough resources to ensure that everybody has that potential to live comfortably off a universal basic income. But it does need a few changes, and considering how lacklustre our parliamentary performers are and how lacklustre the next federal election is going to be concerned in terms of policy, I'd just like to throw a few policies in the mix, something simple, that could resolve our issues. Because I'm sick and tired of waking up every day and somebody telling me about poverty in this country. And I'm sick and tired of 30,000 plus charities putting their hands out every day and asking me to donate money, which I'm quite happy to do, to resolve issues that the state should resolve. And I'm sick and tired every day of hearing people in the legacy media and social media talk about how, wonderful they are and how it ratchets everybody else. So a few suggestions. I only make suggestions. I've got no power. All I've got is the power to talk about things. I don't make decisions. How about a 1% financial turnover tax on all financial transactions over $5,000? We've got a 10% goods and services tax, which has a profound impact on those who earn the least. But we don't have a financial transaction tax. How about a 1% stock market turnover tax? Everything is computerised these days. It's so easy to press a button and put 1% of every transaction on these stock markets, in the Australian stock market, to go into the federal treasury. 1% tax, won't even see it or feel it. You can claim it as a tax deduction, which you do already anyway. And how about saying to those wonderful transnational, locally owned corporations that mine this country's resources and then give us a little bit back in tax and occasionally some royalties, say to them, well, theoretically, everything under the ground belongs to the state. If you don't pay, say, 90% tax on your profits, we'll take over your company. Or even compulsorily acquire them. Oh, I can see people falling over. Compulsorily acquire these corporations and use the profits that are made from the mineral resources to look after the interests of all Australians, including First Nations people. How radical. How disgusting. Well, if it's good enough for Norway, who's got trillions of dollars in their future fund, for only a population of 4.5 million, why isn't it good enough for little old Australia? And it's not good enough for little old Australia because real power doesn't lie in Parliament. You can use Parliament to highlight, as Senator Lydia Thorpe does, to highlight the inadequacies of the world, but real power doesn't lie in Parliament. It lies in the boardrooms of national and transnational corporations. It lies in the hands of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It lies in the hands of media moguls who dictate parliamentary policy, as I spoke about at the beginning of the program. So, think about it. You want change, you need to get involved in activities which promote change. So I encourage you to look at the Public Interest Before Corporate Interests website, PIBCI, PIBCI.net. Universal Basic Income is one of their major policies. Look, I'm the registered officer for PIBCI. It's one of those organisations which is really ground to a halt. We are looking for new members. You can join online. Go to pibci.net, have a look, see what you think. Join online today. Let's move on. Just like to remind you about the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner Commemoration on the 20th of January here in Melbourne. Midday to goes to about 2 p.m. usually. So who are Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner? You see, colonisation was an interesting process in Australia because of the brutality. And we're usually told, it was the squatters, it was the released convicts, it was all these nasty people who were responsible. And, as far as the authorities were concerned, they did their best to resolve the issue, all right? Well, you know the history. I don't have to tell you the history of the, hacking people to death, because you needed their lands for your sheep and you needed their water for your sheep so you could actually export wool to the satanic mills, in England. And, the poison flour, and all that stuff. I could tell you that. It's there. It's in the history books. Look it up. See, but Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner were different. They were two Tasmanian Aboriginal men, a party of 17, which came across from Flinders Island, the remnants of the Indigenous people in Tasmania after the 30 Years' War in Tasmania. They came across to Victoria. They were brought across by Mr. Robinson for a fee, not to them but to Mr. Robinson, to civilise the Victorian blacks. And after a few years, Robinson got sick of them. They disappeared into the wilderness, in inverted commas, area, Mornington Peninsula, Dandenong Ranges, and Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner and 3 women, Planobina, Putirana and Truganini, declared war and were involved in skirmishes for a number of weeks around that area. They caused consternation. Squatters were, and their families raced back to Melbourne. They were tried, found guilty and hung. So this is one of those occasions where we see how the British authorities in this country reacted to resistance to the colonisation process. It wasn't just about what happened behind the scenes. It's what happened as a consequence of British law at that particular point in time. Now, after a 10-year struggle in 2016, a monument has been erected to Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner at the spot they were executed. That's right. And if you find yourself in the city of Melbourne, if you're coming from interstate, or if you live in the city of Melbourne, if you're coming from regional Victoria, go to the monument at the corner of Franklin and Victoria Street in Melbourne. Pay your respect, leave some flowers. It's a little bit of difficulty getting there these days. Stops at Melbourne. A lot of tunnels been dug by Mr. Pallas, who's now retired. I'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of tunnels been dug, but come along. Now, on the 20th of January, the day they were hung in 1842, we held a 1-hour commemoration from 12 to 1 with a number of speakers. And after that, we walked down to the Queen Victoria markets, to the place we think they are, we believe they are buried. So join us, put it on your calendar. It's a family-friendly affair. Bring children along. I encourage you. It's one way people learn about the history of this country. So put that in your calendar, 20th of January. And if you're listening to this program, you are in Melbourne today, which is the 18th of December, we'll be having a little Knees Up Mother Brown shindig at the Footscray Hotel, starting at 6:30 p.m. this evening for listeners of the Anarchist World This Week or other people interested in the ideas that we promote on this program and other programs. And if you can't make it to that, there's always the 19th of December, which is the next day, where we're going to have a picnic from 12 till 3 in the Parliamentary Gardens. You like that? That's at the corner of Lonsdale Street and Spring Street. To bring people and supporters who've, support us for the year, bring people together, to enjoy the afternoon, bring food and drinks to share. So hopefully we'll see you there. Now, the rats are deserting the sinking ship. See, when a political party's fortunes are kind of in the doldrums and they're struggling to survive, and the rats that have been running the ship for a while, see that the ship is listed and there may not be any mechanism via which you can upright the ship in the next few years, then those people who've been involved in that activity tend to jump ship. And the State Treasurer in Victoria, Mr. Pallas, faced with a very difficult task of balancing the books because they've been digging too many holes and not putting enough resources into providing public housing and public resources for Victorians, has decided it's time to tiptoe through the tulips and grab his super and enjoy his life. 10 years as Treasurer, debt of about $180 billion by the end of next year. That's state debt. It's all right. We'll work our way out of it. Tim told us that. That's why he's grabbed his super and he's disappearing. Good luck to you, Tim. That's all I can say. And I'd like to see how many more rats are going to jump the sinking ship in the next year or so. Now I'm going to make a prediction here. Jacinta Allan, the Victorian Premier, will not be going to the election as Premier because she's going to be rolled in the next 12 months by the Deputy Premier. But that's another story. It's a prediction. It's not fact, it's a prediction. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World This Week on your local community radio station. This program has been podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. The Anarchist World This Week will be continuing over the next 2 weeks. It'll be broadcast on Christmas Day as well as New Year's Day. The program on Christmas Day will be concentrating on religion. And on New Year's Day, I'm going to try to see if I can beat Charlie. That's our king, Charles III. Not the turd, you animals, but Charles III. He does a little spot for the colonies, and I think I'll do a spot for our listeners to the Anarchist World This Week. A New Year's Day message. Now, coffee again. You can leave messages 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489. You can actually write to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. You can email us at anarchistage@yahoo.com or info@pibci.net. Facebook pages, Tunnerminnerwait, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheenner. Public interest, YouTube channels, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, josephtoscano.nar, Facebook pages, Public Housing Everybody's Business, Defend and Extend Public Housing, and the list goes, and a personal Facebook page, Joseph Toscano. The list goes on and on. But ultimately, your future is in your hands. It's not in the hands of your religious leaders, not in the hands of the state government or the federal government or anybody else. Ultimately, change comes when enough people, as we've seen in Syria, determine that that moment has arrived. And that moment will arrive for all of us. Thank you for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week. See you on Christmas Day for our special religious report.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around?
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.